All right, guys, it's 2022. It's officially in the building. So, I'm going to show you guys some techniques that I'm going to be incorporating into my workflow, specifically for photography. Now, these are techniques that I've dabbled with in the past, but I'm putting it all together and really came together with this recent shoot that I did. So, I'll be showing you some images from this test shoot that I did. And I'll just show you the images and talk about the three changes I'll be making to my workflow and how they've improved the images. And, hopefully will take my images to the next level. I started shooting photography in 2012, around 2012. So I've been doing this for a while, and I'm an old dog at this point. I have the ways that I take images, and it's just kind of ingrained in me. And one rule I had was always keep your ISO down. Now, 2012, the cameras were not as good as they are now. So if you push up your ISO, your images just deteriorated. So it kind of got stuck with me. And going forward, I always followed that rule. But for this shoot that I did, I was looking to capture the sunrise, and there's not a whole lot of light coming in at this point. So I was forced to increase my ISO to get the exposure that I needed. And it worked out well because during this point, I was like, I'm just doing a test image, so it doesn't need to be perfect. I just want to get the exposure down to get an idea of what the scenery can be like, especially with the sunrise. So I went ahead and bumped my ISO up. And on this image, we can see it's ISO 800. Typically, I will not go over ISO 400, so usually keeping it 300s or lower. And here I was able to bump that up to ISO 800. And surprisingly, there's not a whole lot of noise to the point that it's terrible. I can see the noise, but honestly, I don't care. This is a good amount of not even a good amount of noise. It's fine. It does not take away from the image, and the fact that I'm able to get the exposure that I need where this image is modified, so you don't get the full idea of the dynamic range. But pushing this image, I was able to get quite a wide range of dynamic range on here. The highlights from the sky, they were well maintained. And as you can see here, nothing is blown out on the sky. Also with this light here, there's nothing blown out here on the sign. And then the shadows, I was able to get some details in the shadow the way that I wanted without it being blown out. And altogether, I was able to get the exposure the way I like it without having to sacrifice on the depth of field. Because typically what I will need to do when I keep my ISO so low, you can only do so much, because remember, we have three ways we can change the exposure of an image, right? That's your ISO, your shutter speed, and also your aperture. Now, you can't change the aperture you can't change your shutter speed too much. If not, you need a tripod, and then there's some other issues. Your ISO, you can only modify it so much. So typically I would always just open up my aperture wider. And the issue with that when you're doing landscape or architecture is you start losing depth of field and you get soft areas in your image where you want more detail. So by keeping my aperture closed down to 4.5, I was able to get more detail throughout the image, giving a much more pleasing look to me personally, because I did not want these areas to be blurred out. I wanted a wide depth of field, okay, instead of having that narrow, shallow depth of field. So that's my first change that I'm incorporating, using higher ISO in my images. And the next change that I'll be making is shooting raw. Yes, I know. Everyone's been doing it. All the cool kids are doing it. But personally, for the years that I've been shooting, it's not something that was necessary for me. I was able to get away using JPEGs. It's a smaller files. I didn't have to spend too much time doing post-processing. And I didn't start using Lightroom or Adobe products until recently. So processing raw images was kind of a hassle for me. So JPEG worked well. But over the past year, I've been working on incorporating more using raw images, raw files more. And I've not been impressed. The results have been not worth the file size and the extra work that I need to do. It's not been worth it, but I'm sticking with it. And I was sticking with it because I feel like overall in the long term it will pay off. And sure enough, with this shoot, I think this is where it's finally paying off. Because usually what the issue is that with a JPEG image, you just don't have enough information. So when you're working on the image post and you're doing your post processing, a lot of artifacts start showing up. The image starts to deteriorate because there's just not enough information for you to play with. And when you try changing the exposure or the shadows or your highlights too much, the image just falls apart and it looks terrible. Also, when you're modifying the colors, then your color grading, it just looks terrible. So this is the first time it all came together. For whatever reason, I was able to edit these images and they just came out flawlessly the way I wanted it to look, versus where that was not the case previously. So taking a look at this image here, we can just see, I'll show you the initial, but the dynamic range on here is spectacular. Good dynamic range in the shadows, as you can see here in some of the dark areas. And then also obviously with the highlights, nothing is blown out here. So I was able to pull out details from the shadows, right, without having the highlights being blown out. And the result is we have this nice image that just captures it the way I wanted it to look. And the other benefit here, shooting raw, is that then so this is I added the sky, but if we look here in the sky, we see this beautiful gradient here where we go from orange to yellow to the light blue and then going all the way up to the dark blue. Typically what happens when there's not enough information or you're shooting with a lower quality file or you're editing a low quality file is the image starts to fall apart and you see what's called banding. And the banding is just the transition in color, right? Or in luminance or brightness values. So what happens in the sky is where you will see it, because the sky is not just one color. It's a gradient of blue and different colors here. So we're seeing this gradient going from orange to dark blue. And as we're looking at that, it's very smooth, natural. It looks natural the way we'll typically see it. Raw files are a lifesaver, and I think it's going to just take my images to the next level if I use it appropriately. Maybe I was messing up previously, that's why it didn't come out well, but it is what it is. I've learned my lesson, right? So for the third point, it kind of ties in with what I just talked about with the raw files, and it's just with the image processing. And I used, even though I'm showing these images on Lightroom CC, really I was using Adobe Lightroom Classic to edit the images, the initial stage. And I believe I will use this a whole lot more. Adobe Classic seems to be handling the images a lot better. Now, I'm not sure if it was because of Lightroom CC, because I was using Lightroom CC that my edits did not come out good in the past with raw images, or if it's just the fact that my technique was off. But in this stage, with these images using Lightroom Classic, I was able to get so much higher quality, just the way I wanted the images to look, the way Lightroom Classic handled these images was exactly how I wanted them to be handled. I was able to pull out details from the shadows, and also manipulate the highlights, manipulate the colors without the image just falling apart. The gradients are perfect. There's still detail in the shadows and also in the highlights, and everything turned out damn near perfect. So I'm really happy with how these images turned out, and it just demonstrated some changes that I need to make. And in 2022, that's what I'll be doing. Those 3 changes I'll be making. I'll be shooting more in RAW. I'll also be shooting with a higher ISO, and I'll also be using Adobe Lightroom Classic to modify my images. And I'm excited to see what 2022 brings with my images. I'll be sharing that with you guys. So if you want to try these as well, go ahead. But hey, have a good 2022.